It began as a quiet decision made behind closed doors, far from the mountains where it would unfold. Why would a global superpower send its army into one of the poorest, most fractured countries on Earth? What did Moscow believe it could control in Afghanistan, a land that had swallowed empires for centuries? And how did a war meant to stabilize a friendly government slowly begin to destabilize the Soviet Union itself? At the time, it didn't look like the start of a disaster. It looked like a routine intervention, a calculated move in the Cold War chessboard. In this video, I'm going to discuss all of this, how it began, what happened, and how it changed the world. So without any delay, let's start. To understand why Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan in December 1979, you have to step back long before the first shot was fired. Afghanistan had always occupied a strange position in world politics, sitting at the crossroads of empires, yet never fully absorbed by any of them. For the Soviet Union, Afghanistan was not just a neighbor to the south, it was a buffer, a fragile strip of land separating Soviet Central Asia from the turbulent Middle East and the influence of rival powers. For decades, Moscow had invested quietly in Afghan infrastructure, education, and military training, hoping to pull the country into its sphere without direct rule. Roads, dams, and military academies bore the marks of Soviet aid, and Afghan officers often trained in Soviet institutions, absorbing Marxist ideas along the way. But Afghanistan itself was deeply divided. It was not a unified nation in the modern sense, but a mosaic of tribes, ethnic groups, and regions bound loosely by tradition, religion, and local loyalties. Power in Kabul rarely extended far beyond the capital, and any central government ruled more by negotiation than authority. When Marxist ideas began circulating among Afghan elites in the 1960s and 1970s, they found fertile ground among educated urban youth, but almost no resonance in the countryside, where conservative Islam and tribal customs shaped daily life. This gap between city and village would later become one of the war's most dangerous fault lines. In 1978, everything changed with the Sour Revolution. The Afghan monarchy had already been overthrown a few years earlier, replaced by a republican government that struggled to assert control. Now, a communist coup brought the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan to power. On paper, this seemed like a strategic victory for Moscow. Afghanistan was now ruled by a party that openly aligned itself with Marxist-Leninist ideology and declared friendship with the Soviet Union. But beneath the surface, the new regime was unstable from the start. The party itself was split into bitter factions that distrusted each other more than they trusted any external ally. The new Afghan leadership moved quickly and brutally. Land reforms were announced without understanding local customs, religious leaders were arrested or executed, traditional power structures were dismantled overnight. To the men in Kabul, these were revolutionary steps toward progress. To millions of Afghans, they were an attack on faith, honor, and way of life. Resistance began almost immediately, not as a unified rebellion, but as scattered uprisings in villages and valleys that the central government barely understood. What the Afghan communists called counter-revolution, much of the population saw as self-defense. Moscow watched these developments with growing concern. The Soviet leadership had not planned for a violent revolution in Afghanistan, nor had it intended to manage the consequences directly. Their preference was always for stability, even if that stability came under a friendly but imperfect regime. As reports arrived describing mass unrest, defections in the Afghan army, and assassinations of party officials, Soviet advisors on the ground began asking for more support. The Afghan government, increasingly isolated, asked Moscow for military help again and again. At first, the Soviets refused. The memory of past imperial failures in Afghanistan was not lost on them. They understood the terrain, the tribal structure, and the risks of being seen as a foreign occupier. Instead, they sent weapons, advisors, and economic aid, hoping the Afghan army could restore control. But the situation only worsened. Entire units defected to the rebels, provincial capitals fell out of government hands, the countryside slipped almost entirely beyond Kabul's reach. Then came the internal collapse of the Afghan leadership itself. Hafizullah Amin, one of the most powerful figures in the ruling party, seized control in a violent purge, imprisoning and killing rivals, including the previous leader. Amin claimed loyalty to socialism and to Moscow, but the Soviets deeply distrusted him. His erratic behavior, ruthless methods, and hints of reaching out to the West set off alarm bells in the Kremlin. In the Cold War context, the idea that Afghanistan might slip out of Soviet influence, or worse, become hostile, was unacceptable. By late 1979, the Soviet leadership convinced itself that inaction was more dangerous than intervention. They believed a limited military operation could stabilize Afghanistan quickly, remove Amin, install a more reliable leader, and withdraw within months. This belief rested on a series of assumptions that would later prove disastrously wrong. They assumed the Afghan population would accept Soviet involvement as fraternal assistance. They assumed the resistance was small and disorganized. They assumed the Afghan army, once properly led, would carry most of the fighting. And above all, they assumed they were entering a political problem with a military solution. On a cold December night, Soviet airborne units began landing near Kabul. Special forces stormed key buildings, including the presidential palace. Amin was killed in the assault, and a new leader, Babrak Karmal, was flown in under Soviet protection. Officially, the Soviet Union declared it had responded to a request for help from a friendly government. Unofficially, the invasion marked a turning point. What was meant to be a brief intervention became the start of a long, grinding war. The arrival of Soviet troops changed the nature of the conflict overnight. What had been a civil struggle against a domestic regime now became a jihad against foreign occupation. Resistance fighters, later known collectively as the Mujahideen, gained new motivation and legitimacy. Local grievances fused with religious duty, and calls to defend Islam and homeland spread across valleys and villages. Fighters who had never cared about Kabul politics now took up arms against Soviet forces, whom they saw as godless invaders. The Soviets brought overwhelming firepower. Tanks, artillery, helicopter gunships, and jet aircraft gave them dominance in open combat. They could capture cities, control highways, and destroy rebel concentrations when they found them. But Afghanistan was not a country that could be controlled from highways and capitals alone. The war quickly shifted into mountains, forests, and rural areas where conventional armies struggled. Mujahideen fighters avoided direct battles, relying instead on ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. For Soviet soldiers, many of them young conscripts from across the USSR, Afghanistan was a shock. They had been told they were on a peacekeeping mission. Instead, they found themselves in a hostile environment where the enemy was invisible, the language unfamiliar, and the purpose increasingly unclear. Villages that seemed calm by day could erupt in violence by night. Civilians and fighters blended together, making every interaction tense and dangerous. Morale began to suffer early, though this was hidden behind official propaganda. Back in Moscow, the war was framed as an international duty, a defense of socialism, and a necessary move to protect Soviet security. Casualties were downplayed, and the conflict was rarely discussed openly. But even in its early stages, the war began to drain resources and attention. Equipment had to be shipped thousands of kilometers, troops rotated constantly. The Afghan government remained dependent, fragile, and unpopular despite Soviet backing. What the Soviet leadership failed to grasp was that they had entered not just a war, but a trap shaped by history, geography, and ideology. Afghanistan had defeated stronger empires before, not through decisive victories, but by refusing to be subdued. The longer the Soviets stayed, the more the war would define them, reshape their society, and expose the limits of their power. And beneath the surface, something even more dangerous was beginning to take shape, a conflict that would draw in foreign powers, radicalize fighters, and turn Afghanistan into a central battlefield of the Cold War itself. By the time Soviet commanders began realizing this was not a short operation, the path back was already narrowing. Each loss demanded justification, each escalation made withdrawal look like defeat. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a war on the empire's distant frontier began to echo back into the heart of the Soviet system, setting in motion forces that could not be easily controlled. As the months passed, the war settled into a brutal rhythm that neither side had fully anticipated. Soviet commanders adjusted their expectations, realizing that quick stabilization was no longer realistic. Instead of a short intervention, Afghanistan was becoming a long-term deployment, and with that realization came a shift in strategy. The goal quietly changed from winning hearts and minds to suppressing resistance wherever it appeared. Large-scale sweeps were launched into rebel-held areas, villages cordoned off, villages searched, and suspected fighters detained or killed. From a military standpoint, these operations often succeeded in clearing territory. From a political standpoint, they pushed the population further away. Every destroyed village, every civilian death, every night raid strengthened the narrative that this was not a war for Afghan stability, but a foreign occupation imposed by force. The Mujahideen adapted quickly. They learned not to hold ground, not to defend fixed positions, and not to engage Soviet forces unless conditions were favorable. Their strength lay in patience. They could disappear into the mountains, blend into villages, and return weeks later when Soviet units moved on. Time, more than firepower, became their most reliable weapon. The terrain worked relentlessly against the Soviets. Afghanistan's mountains fractured supply lines and limited mobility. Roads were few and vulnerable, turning every convoy into a potential ambush. Helicopters became essential not only for combat but for basic transport and resupply. The iconic Mi-24 gunship symbolized Soviet dominance in the air, capable of delivering devastating firepower while transporting troops. For a time, it gave the Soviets a psychological edge. But beneath this apparent dominance, weaknesses were growing. Helicopters required constant maintenance and secure bases. Pilots flew predictable routes. As the war dragged on, the Mujahideen studied Soviet tactics carefully, learning when and where attacks were most likely. They observed patterns, adapted their ambushes, and slowly eroded the effectiveness of Soviet operations. What looked like control from the air often masked a lack of control on the ground. Inside Afghanistan, the war was reshaping society at every level. Millions of civilians fled their homes, crossing into Pakistan and Iran as refugees. Entire regions were depopulated, not because of a single decisive battle, but because life under constant threat became unbearable. Refugee camps became recruitment grounds, training areas, and ideological incubators for the resistance. Young men who had lost homes, families, and futures found purpose in the fight. The longer the war continued, the deeper and more personal the grievances became. The Afghan government, despite Soviet backing, struggled to assert legitimacy. Babrak Karmal spoke of national reconciliation, reform, and unity, but his authority rested almost entirely on foreign troops. To many Afghans, he was not a leader, but a symbol of dependency. Corruption, factionalism, and fear hollowed out the state from within. Officials avoided rural areas, soldiers deserted, orders from Kabul often went ignored. The government existed, but it did not rule. Meanwhile, the war was no longer confined to Afghanistan's borders. Across the Cold War divide, other powers were watching closely. The United States saw the Soviet intervention not as a regional issue, but as a strategic opportunity. Memories of Vietnam were still fresh, and there was a growing belief in Washington that the Soviets could be drawn into a similar quagmire. Aid to the Mujahideen began cautiously, then expanded steadily. Weapons, money, and training flowed through Pakistan, turning a fragmented resistance into a more coordinated force. Pakistan itself became a crucial player. Its intelligence services managed supply routes, selected favored factions, and shaped the character of the resistance. This involvement was driven by both ideology and strategy. A weak, unstable Afghanistan under Soviet influence was seen as a direct threat. Supporting the Mujahideen was not just about religion or solidarity, but about shaping the regional balance of power. Afghanistan was becoming an arena where local, regional, and global interests collided. For the Soviets, this internationalization of the conflict complicated everything. What had begun as an internal stabilization mission now faced a steady influx of foreign-backed fighters and resources. Each year, the resistance grew more capable, more confident, and more lethal. Soviet intelligence knew external support was increasing, but stopping it was nearly impossible without widening the war beyond Afghanistan's borders, something Moscow was unwilling to risk. Inside the Soviet Union, the human cost of the war began to surface, despite censorship. Coffins returned quietly to towns and villages across the USSR. Official explanations were vague, deaths attributed to accidents or illness. Families were told little, and public discussion was discouraged. But rumors spread. Soldiers returning on leave spoke of ambushes, corruption, and senseless violence. The image of the Red Army as an invincible force began to crack, especially among those who saw the war up close. The psychological toll on Soviet soldiers was severe. Many struggled to understand the purpose of their mission. They were fighting people who looked poor, poorly equipped, and deeply motivated by beliefs they could not share. The enemy did not wear uniforms, did not fight by conventional rules, and did not surrender easily. This ambiguity bred frustration and fear, which sometimes turned into brutality. The line between combatant and civilian blurred, and in that blur, discipline eroded. Drug use, particularly opium and hashish, became a coping mechanism for some troops. Black markets flourished around bases. Relations with local populations deteriorated further as trust vanished on both sides. The war was no longer just being fought on the battlefield, it was being fought inside the minds of the soldiers sent to fight it. Strategically, the Soviet leadership oscillated between escalation and restraint. Some argued for a more aggressive approach, expanding operations to crush the resistance decisively. Others warned that deeper involvement would only increase losses and international backlash. This lack of clarity filtered down to commanders, who often received conflicting directives: win the war, but avoid civilian casualties; control territory, but do not appear as occupiers; support the Afghan government, but do not replace it entirely. These contradictions made coherent strategy nearly impossible. As years passed, the war settled into a stalemate defined by movement without progress. The Soviets could take almost any area they chose, but they could not hold it permanently. The Mujahideen could not overthrow the government directly, but they could prevent it from governing effectively. Both sides paid a heavy price, but only one side had the option of leaving. And with each passing year, that option became more politically dangerous.
At the same time, the war began to intersect with deeper problems inside the Soviet system. Economic stagnation was worsening. The cost of maintaining tens of thousands of troops abroad strained resources already under pressure. Factories produced weapons and equipment for a war few citizens understood or supported. The gap between official narratives and lived reality widened, feeding cynicism and quiet dissent.
What made Afghanistan especially dangerous for the Soviet Union was not just the battlefield losses, but the way the war exposed systemic weaknesses. It revealed rigid decision-making, an inability to adapt politically, and a tendency to rely on force where legitimacy was absent. Afghanistan became a mirror reflecting flaws the system preferred not to see. And then, in the mid-1980s, something happened that shifted the balance in a way few had predicted. A single technological change, introduced quietly and initially in limited numbers, began to undermine Soviet air superiority. For years, helicopters had been the backbone of Soviet operations, the symbol of control in a hostile land. Now, they were about to become targets. And with that shift, the war entered a new and far more dangerous phase, one that would accelerate the erosion already taking place far beyond Afghanistan's borders. The introduction of that new weapon did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or a sudden collapse, but its impact was felt almost immediately. Portable, shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles began appearing in the hands of the Mujahideen, and with them came a change in confidence that spread through the resistance like electricity. For years, Soviet helicopters had dominated the battlefield, striking villages, escorting convoys, and evacuating wounded with near impunity. Now, pilots had to fly lower, faster, and with constant fear that a single unseen fighter could end their mission in seconds. When the first helicopters were shot down, Soviet commanders initially treated it as an anomaly. Losses had occurred before. But as incidents multiplied, it became clear that air superiority was no longer guaranteed. Each downed aircraft carried not just casualties, but symbolism. The sky, once controlled, was now contested. Soviet operations slowed, convoys hesitated. Entire strategies built around rapid air mobility had to be reconsidered. For the Mujahideen, this shift was transformative. It proved that the Soviets were not invincible. Morale soared. Fighters who had once scattered at the sound of approaching rotors now waited, calculated, and struck. Recruitment increased. External support intensified, justified by visible results. The war, which had already been bleeding the Soviet Union, now began cutting deeper, faster. Inside Afghanistan, the violence escalated in response. Soviet forces turned increasingly to heavy bombardment, attempting to compensate for reduced air freedom with sheer destructive power. Artillery and bombing campaigns intensified, particularly in areas known to support the resistance. Villages were flattened, not because they were strategic targets, but because denying the enemy shelter became a priority. This strategy failed in its stated goal, but succeeded in something else. It drove more civilians into the arms of the resistance and deepened international condemnation. By this stage, the Afghan population had endured years of displacement, loss, and instability. War had become the defining reality of life. Children grew up knowing nothing else. Traditional structures fractured under pressure. In refugee camps, education and identity were shaped not by Afghan history alone, but by narratives of struggle, sacrifice, and religious duty. The conflict was no longer simply about Kabul or socialism. It was about survival, honor, and revenge. Back in Moscow, leadership was changing. The old guard, shaped by World War II and hardened by decades of Cold War confrontation, was aging out. A younger generation, more aware of the Soviet Union's internal stagnation, began to rise. Among them was Mikhail Gorbachev, who inherited not just power, but problems layered over decades. Afghanistan was one of them, and unlike many others, it involved daily casualties and visible failure. Gorbachev viewed the war differently from his predecessors. He did not see it as a symbolic stand that could be endured indefinitely. He saw it as a bleeding wound, draining resources and credibility. But ending the war was not simple. Withdrawal risked humiliation. It risked admitting that the Soviet Union had miscalculated, that it could not impose its will on a smaller, poorer country. And in a system built on the image of strength, such admissions carried enormous weight. Efforts were made to reform the Afghan strategy rather than abandon it outright. New leaders were installed in Kabul, most notably Mohammad Najibullah, who attempted to combine military pressure with political reconciliation. He spoke of national unity, Islamic respect, and gradual reform, trying to distance the government from its earlier ideological rigidity. Soviet advisors supported these efforts, hoping a more Afghan face could stabilize the situation long enough for an honorable exit. On the battlefield, Soviet tactics evolved. Smaller units, better training, and increased emphasis on Afghan forces were introduced. There were moments of tactical success, operations that disrupted resistance networks and secured key routes. But these gains were temporary. The underlying problem remained unchanged. The Afghan government still lacked broad legitimacy, and the resistance, sustained by external support and internal motivation, could afford to wait. International pressure mounted as well. The invasion had shattered the image of détente. Relations with the West froze. The Soviet Union faced boycotts, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation. The 1920 Moscow Olympics became a symbol of this divide, boycotted by dozens of countries. What was intended as a showcase of Soviet prestige turned into a reminder of its growing isolation. Afghanistan was no longer a distant conflict. It was a defining feature of how the world saw the Soviet Union.
Within Soviet society, glasnost began to change the conversation. Information that had been suppressed now surfaced more openly. Journalists wrote about the war. Veterans spoke publicly about their experiences. Casualties were acknowledged. The sanitized narrative of international duty gave way to stories of confusion, trauma, and loss. This openness did not strengthen support for the war, it undermined it. Families began asking questions that had no satisfying answers. Why were their sons dying in a country most had never heard of before the war? What exactly was being defended, and for how long? These questions echoed through a society already grappling with economic hardship and ideological fatigue. For the military, the war exposed painful lessons. Training designed for large-scale conventional warfare in Europe proved ill-suited for guerrilla conflict in mountains and villages. Command structures were rigid. Initiative was often punished rather than rewarded. Soldiers learned through experience what doctrine had failed to teach them. The prestige of the armed forces suffered, not because of individual failure, but because the mission itself felt increasingly hollow. As negotiations quietly began, involving regional and international actors, the outlines of an exit strategy emerged. The Soviet Union sought guarantees that Afghanistan would not become a base for hostile forces once it left. Pakistan and the United States had their own interests, balancing the desire to weaken the Soviets with concerns about long-term instability. Afghanistan itself remained the least powerful voice in discussions about its own future. When the decision to withdraw was finally made, it was framed as a responsible act, a step toward peace. But beneath the official language was a recognition that the war could not be won on acceptable terms. Soviet troops began pulling back, handing over positions to Afghan forces. The process was slow, deliberate, and watched closely by the world. For the soldiers on the ground, withdrawal was bittersweet. There was relief, but also fear. Convoys leaving Afghanistan were vulnerable, and attacks continued. The last months of the war were among the most dangerous, as the resistance sought to claim symbolic victories before the Soviets departed. Every bridge crossed felt like an escape, but also an admission.
When the final Soviet units crossed back into their own territory in 1989, there were no victory parades. There was no sense of accomplishment. The war ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Afghanistan was left devastated, its future uncertain, and the Soviet Union returned home carrying something far heavier than casualties. It carried the knowledge that it had reached the limits of its power. That realization did not stay confined to military circles. It seeped into politics, economics, and identity. If the Soviet Union could not prevail in Afghanistan, what else had it misjudged? What other assumptions were flawed? The war had not caused the system's problems, but it had exposed them mercilessly, and once exposed, they could no longer be ignored. The consequences of that exposure unfolded slowly but relentlessly. The return from Afghanistan did not bring closure. It brought questions, doubts, and a lingering sense of failure that the Soviet system was ill-equipped to process. Veterans came home to a society that did not know how to talk about the war. They were praised formally, yet avoided socially. Their experiences did not fit the heroic narratives that had defined earlier Soviet conflicts. Many struggled with trauma, addiction, and disillusionment, becoming living reminders of a war the state wanted to forget but could not erase. Economically, the cost of the war had been far greater than official figures ever admitted. Years of sustained deployment had drained funds from an already stagnating economy. Equipment losses, logistical demands, and the long-term care of wounded soldiers added invisible burdens. At a time when consumer shortages were growing and living standards were falling, Afghanistan stood as a symbol of misallocated priorities. It was increasingly difficult to ask citizens for sacrifice when the purpose of that sacrifice seemed unclear. Politically, the war eroded trust in leadership. For decades, the Soviet state had claimed strategic foresight and moral clarity. Afghanistan contradicted both. Decisions made by a small circle of aging men led to years of bloodshed with no clear benefit. Glasnost ensured that this reality could no longer be hidden. Archival revelations, investigative reporting, and public debate dismantled the myth of infallibility. Criticism, once unthinkable, became normal. This loss of confidence extended beyond Afghanistan. If leaders had been wrong about the war, what else had they misjudged? Economic planning, relations with the West, the viability of the entire system? Afghanistan became shorthand for systemic failure, a reference point in conversations about reform, accountability, and change. The war had not created dissatisfaction, it had given it a concrete, undeniable form. Within the Communist Party itself, divisions sharpened. Reformers pointed to Afghanistan as evidence that centralized decision-making and ideological rigidity were dangerous. Conservatives warned that admitting failure would weaken the state. This internal struggle played across every major policy debate. Compromise became harder, authority fragmented. The unity that had once held the system together weakened under the weight of unresolved contradictions.
Meanwhile, Afghanistan did not stabilize after the Soviet withdrawal. The government in Kabul, deprived of Soviet military backing, survived longer than many expected, but it was living on borrowed time. The resistance, unified more by opposition than vision, soon turned inward. Factional fighting erupted, devastating cities and communities that had already endured a decade of war. The victory over a superpower did not bring peace, it left a vacuum. That vacuum would have consequences far beyond Afghanistan. Fighters who had gained experience, weapons, and ideological confidence during the war carried those lessons elsewhere. Networks built to fight the Soviets did not disappear. They adapted, reoriented, and searched for new causes. What had begun as a Cold War proxy conflict evolved into something more diffuse and unpredictable, reshaping the nature of global security in the decades that followed. For the United States and its allies, the Soviet withdrawal was framed as a strategic triumph. The narrative was simple: a superpower had been defeated without direct confrontation. But this interpretation overlooked uncomfortable truths. The war had not been clean. The forces empowered during the conflict would later challenge the very states that had supported them. Short-term victory obscured long-term instability. Inside the Soviet Union, events accelerated. The psychological impact of Afghanistan combined with economic crisis and political reform to produce rapid change. Eastern European allies began to break away, emboldened by the realization that Moscow would no longer use force to hold the empire together. The image of Soviet tanks crushing dissent, once a cornerstone of control, had been weakened by their failure to impose order in Afghanistan. The military, traditionally a pillar of the state, found its influence diminished. Afghanistan had revealed its limitations and eroded its prestige. Officers questioned doctrine, soldiers questioned purpose. The armed forces were no longer a unifying symbol, but a contested institution struggling to redefine its role in a changing world. As the Soviet Union approached its final years, Afghanistan loomed large in retrospection. It was cited in speeches, memoirs, and debates as a cautionary tale. Not because it had single-handedly destroyed the USSR, but because it had stripped away illusions. It showed that power had limits, that ideology could not override reality, and that force could not substitute for legitimacy. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 had many causes: economic inefficiency, nationalist movements, political reform gone awry. Afghanistan was one thread among many. But it was a thread that ran visibly through the final decade, connecting internal weakness to external failure. It demonstrated, in a way statistics and theory could not, that the system was no longer sustainable. For Russia, the successor state, the war left a complex legacy. Veterans sought recognition and support. Military reformers studied Afghanistan as a lesson in what not to repeat. Political leaders debated its meaning, sometimes framing it as a noble effort undermined by betrayal, sometimes as a tragic mistake. The interpretation shifted with time and politics, but the impact endured. Globally, the war reshaped how conflicts were understood. It reinforced the power of asymmetric warfare. It showed that local actors, motivated by ideology and supported externally, could outlast superior armies. It influenced military thinking from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, informing both insurgents and counterinsurgents. The shadow of Afghanistan stretched long. Perhaps the most enduring lesson was the danger of misreading society. The Soviet Union entered Afghanistan believing it could engineer stability through force and ideology. It underestimated religion, tradition, and local identity. It overestimated the appeal of its own model. This mismatch between expectation and reality lay at the heart of the failure. By the time the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time over Kabul, the damage was done, not just to Afghanistan, but to the idea of Soviet permanence. Empires do not always fall on the battlefield. Sometimes they unravel when a distant war exposes truths that can no longer be ignored. Afghanistan did that, quietly, relentlessly, and at a cost that extended far beyond its mountains. And as the world moved on, the question remained unresolved. Was the war an unavoidable outcome of Cold War logic or a preventable mistake driven by fear and miscalculation? That question would echo into the final days of the Soviet state and beyond, shaping how future powers would think about intervention, control, and the true price of empire. That price did not end when the last convoy crossed the border. It lingered in ways that were harder to measure but impossible to escape. For Afghanistan, the Soviet withdrawal marked not an ending but a transformation of violence. The structures that might have supported peace had been shattered long before the war ended. Institutions were weak, trust was broken, and weapons were everywhere.
The conflict that followed was no longer framed by superpower rivalry alone, but by internal rivalries sharpened by years of militarization. Cities that had survived the Soviet era were reduced to rubble by factional fighting. Kabul, once a relatively calm capital, became a battlefield among former allies who now saw each other as enemies.
The irony was cruel. A war fought in the name of stability had produced generations who knew only instability. Afghan society, already fragile, was pushed past a breaking point. Education collapsed in many regions, economic life withered. Millions remained displaced, living in limbo across borders. The idea of a unified Afghan state became increasingly distant, replaced by local power structures rooted in militias, warlords, and ideology. What the Soviet Union left behind was not simply destruction, but a vacuum that would be filled by forces far more radical and less predictable than anything Moscow had imagined. Those forces did not stay contained. The Soviet-Afghan War had created a template for modern insurgency, blending local grievances with global narratives. Fighters who had learned to defeat a superpower carried that confidence forward. The belief that faith and persistence could overcome any army became a powerful myth, one that would shape conflicts far beyond Central Asia. Networks forged in refugee camps and training grounds evolved into transnational movements. The war's legacy seeped into global politics, redefining how violence, ideology, and power interacted. For the former Soviet republics in Central Asia, the war cast a long shadow. Many of the soldiers who had fought in Afghanistan came from these regions. Their experiences shaped local attitudes toward Moscow, authority, and military service. As the Soviet Union collapsed, these republics inherited borders, institutions, and insecurities influenced by a war they had not chosen. The fear of instability spreading southward, once a justification for intervention, now became a real concern in a post-Soviet landscape without centralized control. Inside Russia itself, Afghanistan became a reference point whenever the state considered the use of force beyond its borders. Military planners studied it obsessively. Politicians invoked it selectively. Some saw it as a warning against intervention. Others framed it as a lesson in what happens when political will falters. This tension would resurface in later conflicts, where echoes of Afghanistan could be heard in debates about objectives, duration, and exit strategies. The war did not simply end, it became embedded in institutional memory. Culturally, the conflict left scars that surfaced in literature, film, and public discourse. Veteran stories challenged official narratives, revealing the human cost behind strategic decisions. These accounts stripped away abstraction and forced society to confront the reality of war as lived experience. The heroic imagery of earlier Soviet victories felt distant and artificial by comparison. Afghanistan had not offered clear villains or victories, only ambiguity and loss. On the global stage, the war altered perceptions of power. The image of the Soviet Union as an unstoppable force was permanently damaged, but the lesson extended further. The conflict demonstrated that military superiority did not guarantee political success. Control of territory did not equal control of society. This realization influenced policymakers worldwide, shaping how future interventions were justified, planned, and in some cases avoided. Afghanistan became shorthand for the limits of force in complex societies. Yet perhaps the most profound impact of the war was internal, within the Soviet system itself. Afghanistan accelerated processes already underway. It intensified economic strain, amplified public skepticism, and weakened ideological confidence. It forced a reckoning with reality that could no longer be postponed. The system promised rational planning and historical inevitability.
Afghanistan revealed chaos, miscalculation, and human cost. Once that contradiction was visible, belief could not be restored. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not caused by a single war, but wars have a way of exposing truth under pressure. Afghanistan exposed the gap between power and legitimacy, between ideology and lived reality. It showed that authority maintained through force alone was brittle. When economic hardship, political reform, and nationalist movements converged, there was no reservoir of trust left to draw upon. The center could not hold. Looking back, it is striking how small the initial decision seemed. A limited intervention, a friendly government, a short deployment. None of the architects imagined that Afghanistan would become a turning point in world history. Yet history often turns not on grand designs, but on misjudgments compounded over time. Each decision built upon the last, narrowing options until retreat became the only path left. The Soviet-Afghan War stands as a reminder that empires are not undone only by external enemies. They are undone when their actions reveal contradictions they can no longer reconcile. Afghanistan did not defeat the Soviet Union on the battlefield. It defeated the illusion that the Soviet system was immune to failure. And as modern powers continue to face conflicts far from home, in societies shaped by identities deeper than borders or ideology, the shadow of that war remains. It asks a quiet but persistent question, one that history never stops asking those who wield power. Do you truly understand the world you are trying to control, or are you about to learn its limits the hard way?